In the winter of 1943, when the Pacific War seemed to stretch on like an endless horizon of fire and salt, Lieutenant Jack Ferrin pressed a gloved hand to the canopy of his F4U Corsair and felt the cold bleed through. The squadron had taken to calling him Ferrin the Fool, partly because of his reckless grin, partly because of the throttle trick he insisted on practicing, an abrupt torque push that every pilot he met dismissed as either suicidal or stupid. But Jack had survived long enough to make the nickname stick. Sometimes surviving was enough to earn a kind of credibility, even if nobody admitted it aloud. The Corsair beneath him rumbled like a restless animal, eager to claw at the sky. He took a slow breath and stared at the runway ahead, already imagining the vast blue battleground waiting just beyond the horizon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hayes didn't like Jack's maneuver. He didn't have to say it. You could hear it in the clipped tone of every briefing, see it in the hard set of his jaw. The tactic broke too many rules: a split-second throttle slam, torque roll, and immediate climb. Something no sane pilot would try in the middle of a zero swarm. The Corsair's massive propeller was known to buck, jerk, and sometimes throw a pilot into a stall if mistimed by even a breath. But Jack believed the danger was worth it. Up there in the high noon glare, where choices had to be made inside fractions of seconds, perfection was a luxury few lived long enough to chase. Improvisation often became the only language a man could speak. The mission that day was simple in the way paperwork liked to pretend war was simple. Escort a group of bombers toward a Japanese supply harbor north of the island. But every pilot knew the truth beneath the ink. The Zeros owned the low clouds, sliding through them like silver phantoms. A dozen times they had burst from behind the sun, shredding formations before the Americans could blink. And though command was proud of the Corsair, its barbed wing silhouette, its brutish speed, the men flying them knew speed alone wasn't enough. A Zero could arc and twist like a leaf caught in a whirlwind. The Corsair, by contrast, demanded respect, demanded strength, demanded a pilot willing to wrestle it into obedience. The bombers droned ahead like patient giants. Jack tucked his Corsair in close, scanning the watercolor sky for movement. Whenever he flew escort, he felt the weight of their vulnerability, as if it pressed directly on his ribs. The lumbering machines held dozens of men, each with stories, families, tiny miracles waiting back home. Protecting them felt like an impossible promise he kept making, even though part of him feared he wouldn't live long enough to keep any promise at all. Still, he scanned the heavens with the practiced calm of someone who had seen terror enough times to recognize its silhouette before it fully formed. The attack came at the edge of a cloud bank. Jack didn't see the Zeros. He simply felt the sudden shift of the world, the wrongness that slid over the formation like cold water. Then the sky erupted. Silver fighters knifed downward, opening fire before anyone could cry. Warning. One bomber's wing burst into flame, folding like paper. The entire formation tilted into frantic evasive action, engines howling. Jack snapped his Corsair into a climb, engine roaring, pulling G's so hard his vision narrowed into a tunnel of white and grey. A Zero shot past him, its canopy glinting in the sun. Jack recognized the markings. An experienced pilot, one who'd likely sent more than a few Americans into the sea. Jack's heart kicked. He slammed the throttle forward in the same reckless movement Hayes had warned him against. The Corsair's nose jerked, torque dragging the aircraft toward a vicious spin, but Jack held it, caught it, tamed it in the space of a heartbeat. The plane rolled sharply, rising almost vertically, pivoting inside the Zero's anticipated turn path. Watanabe overshot, surprised. Jack felt the surreal shift of the moment, the way sudden opportunity tasted like lightning. He squeezed the trigger. Tracers stitched across the sky, catching the Zero mid-climb. It burst into flame and spiraled downward, vanishing into the sea. But Victory never came alone. 3 more Zeros dove toward him from the sun, firing. Jack jerked sideways, feeling bullets stitch the air around his cockpit. He dove, climbed, twisted. Each motion instinct, shaped by fear and stubborn skill. The bombers were scattering now, their tight formation broken, and Jack knew the escort was collapsing. He needed to draw the Zeros off, needed to do something reckless, foolish, necessary. His breath fogged his visor as he pulled up again, climbing straight into the blinding light. The world disappeared into brilliant white, and for a moment he floated between fear and faith. When the light washed over him completely, he slammed the throttle again. The torque jerked the Corsair sideways, throwing it into an unstable but brutally quick roll. The Zeros overshot once more, their pilots startled by a move no textbook predicted. For a brief second, Jack floated in a pocket of impossible grace. He let the Corsair fall into a controlled dive, firing as he dropped past them. 2 Zeros peeled away, wounded. The third spiraled smoke. But 1 Zero remained, and Jack felt it before he saw it. Like a predator's shadow sliding across the jungle floor, it approached from below. The pilot was disciplined, precise. He didn't rush, didn't fire too early. Jack caught the glint of the rising aircraft and realized instantly this one was different. This pilot wasn't surprised by his maneuver. This pilot had learned. Instinctively, Jack climbed again, but this time the enemy matched him, anticipating the torque roll. The 2 aircraft spiraled in a deadly ascent, each reading the other's intentions like 2 gamblers fighting over the last chip on the table. Jack understood then that technique had limits. You could invent, adapt, gamble. But one day, someone would call your bluff. Breath burning in his lungs, he forced his Corsair into a dive, so steep the aircraft shuddered. The Zero followed. The ocean surged upward, dark and gleaming. Jack pulled up at the last possible moment, wings screaming. The Zero hesitated, just for a heartbeat, and that heartbeat was enough. The Japanese pilot yanked too late, clipped the wave, and vanished in a burst of spray. The battle faded slowly. The surviving Zeros retreated, and the bombers regrouped, shaken but alive. Jack circled above them, his breath coming in ragged pulls. The horizon felt wider than before, heavier. When they landed back at base, Hayes strode up to him, jaw clenched, eyes burning with some emotion Jack couldn't place. Anger, relief, awe. The commander opened his mouth, closed it, then simply nodded. "You kept them alive," Hayes finally said. Jack shrugged, exhausted. "Just got lucky." "Luck doesn't do that," Hayes replied quietly. In the following weeks, the story spread. Pilots whispered that the Fool's trick had saved the entire formation. Engineers wanted to understand the physics. Squadron leaders wanted to study the tactic. Some swore Jack Ferrin had changed the way Corsairs would engage Zeros forever. Others insisted it was a one-time miracle, impossible to replicate. Jack said little. Inside, he felt the strange mixture of pride and fear that came from surviving something he probably shouldn't have. The Pacific didn't care about reputations. It swallowed legends as easily as it swallowed rookies. Yet, something had shifted. The next time Zeros challenged their formation, American pilots, emboldened, inspired, began experimenting, pushing throttle and torque in new ways. Not as recklessly as Jack, but with growing confidence. And the Japanese pilots, once feared for their instinctive mastery of aerial maneuvering, began to encounter Americans who no longer fought predictably. The kill ratios crept upward, 1 to 2, 1 to 3. Jack's squadron even whispered about an astonishing figure. 1 Corsair for 11 Zeros lost. Nobody knew if it was true. Nobody cared. What mattered was that hope had returned. Jack flew dozens more missions, some victorious, some harrowing, some forgotten by history. He never claimed to be a hero. He never explained exactly how he timed the torque pushes or what he felt in the cockpit during those impossible rolls. Part of it was intuition, he insisted. Part of it was madness, But in deep down, he understood the truth. Sometimes the world changes because one person is willing to try something everyone else calls stupid. Sometimes courage looks like recklessness. Sometimes survival demands a leap of faith through the thin line between genius and disaster. On a humid evening near the end of 1944, as the war's tide finally began to turn, Jack stood alone by the airstrip, watching the sun bleed orange into the sea. The Corsairs lined up like silent sentinels. Each carried stories carved into their wings. Jack touched the cool metal of his aircraft, feeling the echo of every maneuver, every narrow escape. He wondered about the men he had fought, the men he had saved, the ones who never came home. War was a ledger of ghosts, he thought, and every pilot owed debts he could never fully repay. A mechanic approached him, wiping grease from his hands. "Heard Command wants to name that maneuver of yours," he said with a half grin. "You're going to be famous." Jack snorted softly. "Call it whatever they want. It won't matter to the ones who didn't make it back." The mechanic nodded, sobered. The wind carried the distant hum of engines, the promise of another mission, another gamble, another day. Jack Ferrin walked back toward his Corsair, helmet under his arm. He paused at the ladder, looking once more at the endless horizon. Then he climbed in, settled into the seat that had become both his cradle and his coffin, and whispered the same words he always whispered before takeoff, words he had never told anyone else. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let today not be the day I run out of miracles. The engine roared to life, drowning the world in thunder, and Lieutenant Jack Ferrin, the fool who defied the sky, rose once more into the burning light of the Pacific War. Years later, long after the guns fell silent and the sea returned to its endless breathing, Jack found himself standing in a museum he never asked to be part of. The Corsair before him was not his, but it looked close enough. Same bent wings, same proud nose, same aura of a predator waiting to leap. Tourists drifted past him, whispering about a display plaque that mentioned a nameless pilot whose unconventional maneuver had baffled enemy aces and saved a flight of bombers. They had given the trick an official name, though Jack barely recognized it. A young boy approached him, wide-eyed, staring up at the aircraft as though it were a dragon frozen mid-flight. "Do you think you could have flown something like that?" the boy asked, not knowing who he was speaking to. Jack smiled gently. "Maybe," he said, "if I were brave enough." The boy puffed his chest. "I'll fly one someday." Jack nodded. "Then remember this, sometimes the move that saves your life is the one no one believes in. But you should never do it to be clever. Do it because someone else needs you to." The boy didn't fully understand, but he nodded anyway. Jack watched him disappear into the crowd, before turning again to the Corsair, resting a hand on its wing. It felt like touching an old friend through the glass of memory. He whispered, "We made it farther than anyone expected." For a moment he stood completely still, letting the quiet hum of the museum settle around him like a gentle tide. Strange, he thought, how a lifetime of danger could distill into a single echo of gratitude. The world had changed, yet, somewhere within its vastness, the sky still remembered. He stayed. The war in the Pacific had changed. By early 1945, the island-hopping campaigns had carried American forces closer to the heart of Japan. Jack Ferrin, now a seasoned veteran of countless sorties, found that the thrill of aerial combat had become a strange mixture of ritual and burden. Every mission brought new odds, new enemy tactics, but also a growing weight. The faces of those who hadn't returned, the echoes of bombs, the smell of smoke and salt and burned oil. Courage was no longer a spark, it had become a muscle. He flexed with every heartbeat, yet even muscles tire. One morning, the briefing room smelled of coffee, paper, and fatigue. Jack traced the rim of his cup absent-mindedly, while Hayes outlined the plan: a raid on a heavily fortified Japanese airbase on the island of Kyushu. Intelligence suggested the Japanese had deployed a new variant of the Zero, faster, sleeker, more lethal. Their fleet was bolstered with anti-aircraft flak that had shredded previous formations, leaving pilots dead before they could even reach the target. Hayes's voice was steady, but there was tension beneath it, the kind that only comes from knowing too many men won't return. Jack glanced around at his squadron, faces pale, eyes alert, hands gripping flight helmets like lifelines. Among them was a young pilot named Reynolds, barely 20, with a nervous energy Jack recognized from his own first missions. He remembered his own fear, the way it had coiled around him, threatening to paralyze until he found some foolish courage. Jack reached over and gave Reynolds' shoulder a firm squeeze. "Keep your eyes sharp," he said. "And remember, the trick isn't about the plane, it's about you." Reynolds nodded, swallowing hard, and Jack saw the same mixture of terror and determination he had felt. It was a look that never left a pilot's face completely. It just shifted as the years went on, hidden behind cocky grins and casual banter. When the Corsairs roared down the runway, Jack felt the familiar vibration of the engines through his chest. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead, a canvas of sun and cloud and impossibility. Each plane leapt into the sky, a living arrow toward danger. As they climbed, the briefing echoed in his mind. "Hit hard, hit fast, protect the bombers, and pray the Zeros don't overwhelm you." The first sign of the enemy came as a ripple across the sunlight. Jack saw it before he heard it. The glint of metal against metal, the faint traces that suddenly stitched the air. Then the Zeros dove from the cloud cover. Their precision terrifying. Their coordination exact. One of Reynolds' planes jolted violently, smoke curling from the wing. Jack's stomach dropped, but he didn't hesitate. "Follow my lead," he muttered into the radio, and then instinct and experience took over. He pushed the throttle. Torque slammed hard, and the Corsair leapt upward in a maneuver that had become second nature to him, but still bordered on reckless genius. The enemy overshot, and Jack squeezed the trigger. The first Zero spiraled into a cloud of fire and smoke. Around him, the air became chaos. Bombers swerved desperately, tracer fire lacing the sky, flak bursts erupting below like deadly fireworks. Jack felt the familiar edge of fear, sharp and cold, but tempered by years of knowing that panic was the enemy. He dove and twisted, pulled and banked, each movement precise yet desperate, a violent dance with death. The Zeros were faster now, smarter, adapting, but Jack had something they did not: the memory of every previous encounter, every impossible maneuver, every narrow escape. Reynolds called over the radio, voice shaking. "Lieutenant, I think I'm hit." Jack saw the smoke trailing from Reynolds' left wing, a thin but ominous streak. He didn't have time to worry, but the instinct to save him was immediate. He banked sharply, drawing fire toward himself to shield Reynolds. Bullets splintered the air, but the Corsair held. Jack signaled for Reynolds to follow a climb-and-roll maneuver, one he had developed through countless hours of improvisation. The young pilot executed it hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, and the two of them broke free from the immediate threat. The bombing run awaited. The enemy had the advantage of altitude and the element of surprise, but Jack had calculated every risk. As they approached the airbase, he saw it in full: hangars aflame, anti-aircraft guns ready, and a line of Zeros patrolling like sharks along the runway. He adjusted his approach, telling his squadron to maintain formation and draw flak fire away from the bombers. Jack's mind narrowed to a single point of focus: timing. Every second mattered. Every movement had to be precise. The first wave of Corsairs hit, drawing enemy fire, and Jack felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. He could almost see the physics of it, the invisible lines of force acting on wings, air, and bullets. He pushed the throttle again, torque twisting the Corsair in a way that seemed impossible to anyone watching. Two Zeros collided mid-air, a violent ballet of steel and smoke. The bombers released their payloads with mechanical precision, and the explosions rocked the island below. Yet, victory came at a cost. Jack saw Reynolds' plane shudder violently. The smoke had grown thick. He dove alongside, matching his wingman's movements, guiding him with hand signals and clipped radio commands. The Corsair groaned under the strain, but they emerged from the enemy perimeter. Reynolds' plane was damaged, but they had survived the worst. As they regrouped over the sea, Jack looked back at Kyushu. The fires still burned, and he knew that men on both sides had died in the inferno below. It was a strange feeling. The mix of triumph and grief, pride and guilt. Every pilot carried it, a heavy weight hidden behind casual laughter or silence. Jack knew he would never be free of it. When they returned to base, the aftermath was immediate. Mechanics swarmed Reynolds' Corsair, assessing damage. Pilots recounted the raid in bursts of exhilaration and horror. Hayes approached Jack, hands on hips, eyes shadowed with both relief and weariness. "You did well," Hayes said quietly. "All of them made it back because of you, but don't mistake it for luck." Jack shook his head. "It's not just me," he said. "It's everyone. We survived because we trusted each other, because we adapted." Hayes nodded. "And because you refused to give up. Don't let that go, Ferrin. It's a rare gift." The days that followed were quieter, but never peaceful. Jack spent them checking planes, mentoring younger pilots, and replaying aerial battles in his mind like a cruel slideshow. Each mission carried the weight of history and probability, and then came the orders he had been dreading, a strike on the Japanese mainland itself, targeting industrial zones critical to the war effort. It was the kind of mission that veterans feared, the kind that tested courage and sanity in equal measure. As the squadron prepared, Jack walked along the runway at dawn. The air was crisp, carrying a thin salt tang from the nearby ocean. He stopped at the edge of the tarmac, looking at the horizon tinged with gold and violet. Somewhere beyond lay the unknown, a place where skill, courage, and luck would collide violently. He thought of Reynolds, of all the pilots he had flown with, of the men who had died and the men who would die. And yet, beneath the dread, there was a strange clarity. Jack whispered to himself, as he always did before takeoff, "Let today not be the day I run out of miracles." The Corsairs roared to life, and the squadron lifted into the sky like a single living organism. They climbed through clouds, breaking into the high sunlight, the enemy below like shadows, waiting to strike. Jack felt the same cold thrill, the same sense of responsibility, the same mixture of fear and exhilaration. He could see the enemy waiting, the new Zeros ready to test him and his squadron. But he was ready. He had learned to anticipate, to improvise, to turn panic into precision, and above all, he had learned that sometimes survival depended not on rules, but on courage, on the willingness to take a move no one else would dare. As they approached the target, flak erupted in violent blossoms, and Zeros came screaming out of clouds like steel ghosts. Jack pulled the Corsair into a roll, diving and twisting, dodging fire that would have killed less experienced pilots. His squadron followed, each man trusting instinct, training, and Jack's improvised maneuvers. Explosions rocked the industrial zone below, smoke and flame consuming factories that had once produced weapons, now scattered by his squadron's intervention. Amid the chaos, Jack spotted a group of bombers struggling under intense fire. Without hesitation, he maneuvered his Corsair to intercept incoming Zeros, using every trick, every torque push, every split-second roll he had ever mastered. One by one, he drove the enemy away, feeling the strain of gravity, fear and adrenaline bending around him like a living force. By the time they regrouped over the coast, the industrial zone lay in smoldering ruin. The enemy had been repelled, the bombers intact, but the cost was visible in every shaken face and damaged wing. Jack felt exhaustion seep into his bones, but also a fierce pride. They had done the impossible again. When they landed, Hayes met him, eyes tired but sharp. "Ferrin," he said, voice low, "you've done more than survive. You've shown what it means to fight with your mind, your hands, and your heart. Don't forget that." Jack nodded. "I won't," he replied, feeling the weight of truth in the words. Night fell over the base, and Jack sat alone by the edge of the tarmac, listening to the soft roar of engines cooling. The Pacific wind carried distant echoes of battle, and he thought of all the men still out there, all the missions yet to come, all the chances for courage and survival. He felt the same mixture of fear, grief, and awe he had felt since his first flight, but also a quiet determination. Somewhere in the distance, a young pilot like Reynolds looked up at the sky and imagined himself flying into history. And Jack Ferrin, the fool who had defied the impossible, would always be there in spirit, a reminder that sometimes one person's courage could tilt the balance between life and death, between despair and hope. The war was far from over, but for the first time in months, Jack allowed himself a moment of stillness. The horizon glowed faintly, as if acknowledging his silent vow to keep flying, to keep fighting, to keep defying the impossible. And in that fragile, fleeting peace, he understood that the miracles he had relied upon were not random. They were born from skill, courage, and the unyielding refusal to surrender. Jack Ferrin rose, ready for the next mission, ready to face whatever the sky would throw at him, carrying with him the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, one pilot's daring could make all the difference. The final months of 1945 brought the war to a fevered pitch. Jack Ferrin could feel it in every mission, the desperation of a dwindling enemy, the mounting pressure on Allied forces, and the shadows of exhaustion and grief that clung to every pilot. Each sortie carried the weight of not just strategy, but legacy, the knowledge that their actions could tip the scales toward victory, or prolong the suffering of millions. It was late August when the orders came. A coordinated strike on Tokyo's industrial heart, a mission so critical that failure was unthinkable. Intelligence suggested that Japanese anti-aircraft defenses had grown more concentrated, and the skies were dense with Zeros, kamikaze pilots, and flak that could tear through a formation in seconds. Hayes called it a mission that will test every man who flies it. But the truth was sharper. It would test every soul. Jack stood on the tarmac, staring at the lineup of Corsairs. The morning sun glinted off the wings, a cruelly serene contrast to the storm they were about to fly into. Around him, the young pilots, now weathered by months of combat, checked weapons, double-checked instruments, and tried to quiet the gnawing fear in their stomachs. Jack could see Reynolds among them, his youthful energy tempered by the hard lessons of survival. He gave the boy a nod, the unspoken promise that he would guide him through this storm if possible. The engines roared to life, and the squadron lifted as one into the sky, a silver arrow cutting through the morning haze. Jack's mind narrowed to focus. He didn't think of death or survival. He thought of the men relying on him, the bombers they were to protect, and the impossible odds they would face. As they approached Tokyo, the flak began. Bursts of orange and black dotted the sky, each explosion threatening to shred wings and bodies alike. The Zeros came in waves, agile and precise, diving from cloud cover with deadly intent. Jack's hands were steady on the throttle, eyes scanning, calculating. He led his squadron in defensive maneuvers, twisting and banking, pulling his men through a choreographed dance with death. A kamikaze plane veered toward one of the bombers. Jack's reaction was instantaneous. He dove, positioning himself between the bomber and the enemy aircraft, his own Corsair absorbing the fire. The kamikaze's plane clipped Jack's wing, spinning off violently into the skyline. The bomber was spared, and Jack pulled up hard, adrenaline pumping like molten metal through his veins. Reynolds called over the radio, voice strained but steady. "Lieutenant, I think I can make it through." Jack heard the determination in the young pilot's words, and it steadied him. "You will," he replied. "Just follow my lead." The mission pressed on. Factories erupted in flames below, black smoke rolling into the sky as bombs found their marks. Jack could see the devastation and the precision. Each explosion a combination of planning, courage, and the fragile chaos of combat. Around him, pilots twisted and turned, every action a calculation of life and death. But the cost of this mission was already becoming clear. One by one, planes in the formation faltered, engines failing under flak, wings shredded by bullets, pilots too exhausted to maintain control. Jack's heart clenched with every loss, but he had no time to mourn. Survival required focus, and he forced his mind into the rhythm of flying, thinking of physics, air currents, and angles as if the sky were a game of chess with death as the opponent. Then, in a sudden burst of realization, he saw the commander of the kamikaze formation, a glint of steel intent on destruction. Jack dove, twisting his Corsair to intercept, firing with unerring precision. The enemy plane exploded in midair, debris scattering like deadly confetti. The bomber behind him wobbled slightly, then stabilized, saved by Jack's split-second intervention. Around him, the squadron fought a war of attrition. Jack realized with grim clarity that victory here was not about glory, it was about survival, about ensuring that the men under his wing could return home. Every maneuver, every daring dive, every calculated risk was a choice between life and death for someone else. Hours passed in a blur of speed, smoke, fire and metal, and the city below was a mosaic of chaos and destruction, the human cost of war etched in every block, every street, every shattered building. Jack felt the familiar mixture of pride and grief, a combination that had become his constant companion. He thought of Reynolds, of Hayes, of every pilot he had flown beside, and of every man who had fallen. The final challenge came as they turned for home. A concentrated squadron of Zeros, faster and deadlier than any they had faced before, dove from the clouds in a coordinated attack. Jack's squadron, already depleted, was tested to its limits. He took the lead, weaving through tracers and flak, his Corsair groaning under the stress. Bullets shredded the wings of planes on either side, and Jack's stomach tightened with fear that was now mixed with determination, so sharp it hurt. Jack's eyes caught Reynolds struggling to evade two Zeros closing in fast. Without hesitation, Jack dove, splitting his Corsair's trajectory to intercept the attackers. Bullets tore through his fuselage, the plane shuddering violently, but he didn't release his grip. He fired, watched the first Zero spiral into a cloud, then the second, and only then allowed himself a brief, ragged breath. Reynolds' plane wobbled slightly, then steadied. Jack signaled for him to follow, and together they guided the remaining pilots out of the immediate danger. As they crossed the open sea, the reality of what they had survived began to sink in. The bombing run had succeeded. Tokyo's industrial centers lay in ruin, the enemy's ability to continue prolonged resistance weakened, but the cost was evident in the empty spaces beside them, the pilots who would never see home again. Jack felt the ache of loss, a familiar shadow, but also the quiet pride of having led men through the impossible. When they landed, the base was alive with activity. Mechanics repairing damage, medics tending the wounded, pilots recounting the battle in breathless tones. Hayes met Jack as he climbed from the Corsair, eyes dark with fatigue and relief. "Ferrin," he said, voice low, "you did more than survive. You kept every man you could alive. That's the kind of courage history remembers." Jack shook his head. "It wasn't just me," he said. "Every man out there made the difference. We survived because we trusted each other, because we adapted, because we refused to give up." Hayes nodded slowly. "I know, but it still takes someone like you to lead the way. Don't forget that." That night, Jack walked along the quiet runway, listening to the distant hum of engines winding down. The sky was clear, stars glinting like the eyes of those who had fallen. He thought of every mission, every impossible maneuver, every moment when he had stared death in the face and chosen to fly anyway. And he thought of Reynolds, now a young man tempered by war, but carrying within him the courage Jack had nurtured. In that stillness, Jack realized that the war had changed more than maps or cities. It had changed men. It had revealed the capacity for fear and heroism, for despair and hope, sometimes within the same heartbeat. And he understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that survival was never luck. It was skill. It was courage. It was the quiet, unwavering refusal to surrender, even when the odds were impossible. The following morning, Jack received word that the war had ended. The Japanese surrender had been formalized, and the long nightmare of blood and fire was finally over. Relief swept through the base like a sudden wind, but Jack felt a complicated mixture of joy and sorrow. Victory had been won, yes, but the cost was permanent. The men who had survived would carry their memories forever. Those who had not would live on in memory and story. Jack walked through the rows of Corsairs one last time, running his hands along the wings. They had been more than machines. They had been shields, weapons, lifelines, and companions. Each scratch, each dent, each burn mark was a testament to survival, to daring, to human ingenuity under pressure. He found Reynolds near the edge of the airfield, staring at the rising sun. The young pilot turned when Jack approached. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "thank you for everything. I wouldn't have made it without you." Jack smiled, a tired, genuine smile. "You did it yourself," he said. "I just reminded you what you were capable of. Don't forget it." The two men stood in silence, watching the light spill across the Pacific, knowing that the world they had fought to protect would never fully understand the courage it had taken to survive. Yet in that moment, it didn't matter. They had lived through the impossible. They had turned fear into precision, despair into action, and hope into survival. As Jack Ferrin walked away from the airfield, he carried with him the knowledge that war had tested the limits of human endurance, and that sometimes the difference between life and death, between defeat and triumph, lay in the courage to fly, to fight, and to never surrender, even when the odds were impossible. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel it fully. The quiet, unshakable relief of survival. The deep, enduring pride of having faced the impossible, and the knowledge that the story of courage he had lived would ripple through history long after the echoes of guns and engines had faded. Jack turned toward the horizon, the rising sun casting gold across the Pacific waves, and knew that the world was waiting for him, waiting for all of them, to rebuild, to remember, and to live. The war was over. The courage remained, and the impossible, Jack realized, had been conquered. Jack Ferrin returned home in late 1945, stepping off the transport plane onto a runway that smelled of wet asphalt and smoke, a ghost of the airfields he had left behind. America was changing around him. Cities thrummed with life again, and children ran freely in streets that had been hushed by rationing and worry for years. But for Jack, the world had a sharper edge now. The war had left its mark, and he carried it in ways invisible to those who had never known what it meant to stare death in the eye and hold it off. The first weeks were disorienting. The noise of normal life felt loud, almost cruel. He visited the small house he had grown up in, walking through rooms lined with familiar furniture that seemed smaller than memory had preserved. His mother greeted him with tears and laughter, the contradictions of relief and sorrow tangled together in her embrace. Jack held her tightly, feeling the gap that years of absence and danger had left between them. Letters had arrived from the men he had flown with, some alive, some forever missing. Reynolds's handwriting was precise but hesitant, revealing a young man still processing what survival had demanded. "Lieutenant," it read, "I am alive because of you. I think I understand now what it means to lead, to carry responsibility for more than yourself. Thank you." Jack folded the letter carefully, the weight of those words pressing on his chest. Evenings were harder. He would sit on the porch of his childhood home, staring at the horizon as the sun bled into the sky, and the memories would come. Flashes of fire and smoke, the roar of engines, the faces of men who had fought beside him and never returned. He sometimes found himself reaching for the radio, instinctively expecting the chatter of the squadron, and realized with a pang that the world he had known was gone, irretrievable. Yet in this quiet, Jack began to notice the small miracles of survival. Neighbors mended fences and tended gardens, children laughed in streets that once echoed with ration lines, and the hum of trains and factories carried a rhythm of normalcy he had long forgotten. Slowly, he began to understand that victory was not only measured in destroyed enemy infrastructure or strategic advantage, it was also in the fragile act of rebuilding, of reclaiming life after years of chaos. Jack's days were soon filled with work he had never anticipated. He enrolled in engineering courses, inspired by the ingenuity that had saved lives during the war, particularly the development of the proximity fuse he had relied on in countless missions, the technology that had seemed like magic in the skies above Tokyo now became a path for shaping peace, a way to ensure that human effort could serve life instead of destruction. He also sought out veterans groups, listening to the stories of men and women who had returned from Europe and the Pacific. Some could speak of triumph without tears, others could barely look at him without flinching. Jack learned to sit with their pain, to share it without judgment, and to allow the unspoken bond of survival to sustain them. He found himself quietly guiding younger veterans, much as he had guided Reynolds, offering a steady hand to those who had known only chaos. One afternoon, Jack visited the small cemetery where many of his squadron had been commemorated. Headstones glinted under the sun, names etched in stone, silent witnesses to bravery and sacrifice. He lingered by a particular marker, one that carried the name of a pilot he had flown beside in Tokyo, a man who had saved a bomber only to be struck down moments later. Jack traced the carved letters with a trembling finger, whispering a promise to remember to carry forward the courage and humanity that had defined their missions. Over time, Jack began to speak publicly, sharing lessons learned in the crucible of combat. He recounted not just maneuvers and strategies, but the emotional truths of fear, trust, and leadership. Crowds gathered, some seeking inspiration, others closure. He never glorified battle. Instead, he spoke of responsibility, of the quiet heroism in choosing to act despite fear, and of the enduring cost of conflict. The words were heavy, yet they carried a healing power for both speaker and listener. Reynolds eventually returned to visit, now a young man whose eyes carried both the remnants of war and the spark of ambition. They walked along the coast near Jack's home, planes glinting far above in the sky, shadows of the past mingling with present light. "I've learned to live with it," Reynolds said quietly. "I still hear it sometimes, the engines, the fire, but I've learned that life continues. That's what you taught me." Jack nodded, understanding that survival was more than physical. It was the endurance of spirit, the capacity to rebuild, to hope, to act in the face of an uncertain future. Even as the years stretched on, Jack carried a disciplined attention to detail and courage shaped by fire. He built a career around innovation and leadership, but never let go of the memory of the skies above Tokyo, the cries of men in battle, and the weight of responsibility that had defined him. Every decision, every act of mentorship, every technical breakthrough was infused with the lessons of war. That ingenuity and bravery could coexist with compassion, and that even in devastation, the human heart could choose courage. The war had ended, but its echoes never fully faded. Jack often visited the airfield where he had first flown Corsairs, now quiet save for the hum of modern training aircraft. Standing there, he felt a connection to the past and a responsibility to the future. The impossible feats of survival, the split-second decisions, and the courage that had defined those missions remained alive in him. a living testament to what it meant to face fear and act with resolve. As he watched the sun dip below the horizon, Jack Ferrin realized that life itself was a series of missions, some visible, some silent, and that the legacy of courage lay not only in victories or honors, but in the quiet acts of guidance, compassion, and resilience that defined what it meant to truly survive and live. The skies he had flown through were behind him, but their lessons would guide him forever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.